Okay, so you can hear Fiverr in the background, sneezing and sniffling. He's got some kind of allergy today, and you can hear the coffee maker in the background, bubbling and rumbling and producing its desired effect. And you can hear the frog or frog-like or quasi-amphibious type onomatopoeics in my voice as a result of my cold, and you can hear the buzz of the refrigerator in the background as well, if you listen carefully, and you can hear Lori moving on her chair, or maybe you can't. I don't know. I can, but that's quite a bit in the background, and you can't hear the. I doubt that you can hear, because I can't hear the sound of the heater. The thermostat, which is part of our discourse in a different discursive domain, but the thermostat has informed the heating unit to turn itself off because it's reached the desired 75 degrees from whatever it was below that, and it may kick in later, and you'll have the opportunity to hear all of that in the background. But if all of these sounds, if all of this materiality were part of the aesthetics of this piece, and if they were arranged right, symphonia arrangement, if they were arranged in such a way as to produce, either an acoustic or an acoustic, plus aesthetic experience, in one way or another, if a muse, were responsible for the interest in all of these materials and the selection of this background, in the way that John Cage is interested in the sounds of the world, and sometimes the interest and attention that he pays to the sound of the world is perhaps, although he's certainly interested in this as well. And I'm not saying that John Cage, and a piece like 4 minutes and 33 seconds has, is it 4 minutes and 33 seconds, or is it 3 minutes and 44 seconds? I'm going to call it 4 minutes and 33 seconds. But in a certain way, it's arbitrary, and could perhaps have been represented by the duration of time, 3 minutes and 44 seconds. And I'll have to look further into that and see if there's any particular significance. If, for example, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, it turns out to be an average duration for a particular interlude of a passage of music, as performed, for solo piano, or what other references, that might be too. But the point is that any arbitrary or aleatory designation of duration could represent a period of time in which the occupation of a space and provides the opportunity for meditation on the drama, if one likes, or the comedy, if one prefers, or the narrative, if one engages that, or simply the occurrence, right? The being in the now of the acoustic presence of the materiality of sound for the length of that duration. And what I described and called attention to and what was going on in the background is motivated by something similar. And in that respect, although Cage's interest in what we would call the Muse arche, origin, element, being, is not entirely dissimilar to Duchamp's engagement with ready-mades, either the fountain or the bicycle wheel, the concrete presence of the materiality of the page, as in concrete poetry. What artists like Craig Dworkin are interested in volumes, such as the collection A Radium of the Word, whose title is adopted from a poem by Mina Loy describing the poetry of Gertrude Stein, I had a friend when I was in UCSD, and he produced this kind of interesting, materially motivated series of poetries, and one of them was called Machinist, and it was variously lists of words, and but also an attention to the material surface of the page, and then these words he would Xerox and reproduce in various ways until the adding a kind of almost feedback to the production and regeneration of these word lists, and they would evolve and change in all sorts of interesting ways, based on the material dynamics of reproduction and noise elements in the system, those aspects of reproduction that were not only the fidelity of reproduction, but the infidelity of reproduction became part of the material production of these images and part of the aesthetics. Well, all this belongs under the domain of the Muse arche, and what I was getting at with the Duchamp is that his interests are more firmly, and one could say, phenomenologically rooted in arche than those of Duchamp, because in Duchamp there is still very much this gestural element in which ideas of authorship and the framing and contextualization of definitions and authorizations, right, of what constitutes art, and are made as social gestures in relationship to certain communities, and those communities, particularly for Duchamp, have social histories, and relate to codes of behavior and what's considered acceptable or not acceptable, and Duchamp, in a certain way, not unlike artists, like Toulouse-Lautrec, Baudelaire, Rimbaud, to a lesser degree, Verlaine, but Alfred Jarry, could certainly be considered. Is like these artists, he's interested in transgression. This Muse transgression, and the Muse of transgression is not of any particular interest to Cage, at least insofar as I see him. Maybe there are subtleties in the way that he plays out his interest in the phenomenology of hearing and the experience of this almost Zen-like attentiveness, to the acoustic conditions of what can be called the present, or the duration of the now, right? But all of that, exists, as I would define it, at least, and as I'm here, reiterating, David's opening to this piece, which we can call here, and before I lose track and fail to name this piece. This is Notes Towards the Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling, Part 6. And here's, and in Part 6, I believe it's Part 6. Perhaps it's it must be Part 7, and I'll recall why it's Part 7, and as I'm recalling why it's Part 7, I'm going to correct my failure to have changed the designation of the 6 to the 7 in my textual representation of this part. The reason that I know it's Part 7 is I recall that there was a discussion of the initial 5 muses, right? That Pausanias identified as an initial set of 3 muses, but through an analysis of where these muses might reside in the heavens as a constellation, and the metapoetical necessity of the designation of this constellation as Asteri, a star, we determined that the geometric figure of a triangle represented by the number 3 would have been inadequate to the constellational configuration of muses and the metapoetic pun, right? Star among the stars, and so we determined that there had to be 5, and because there were 5, we determined that this, I can recall that this must have been the 5th section of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling. And because it was the 5th section in David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling, it must have been the 6th section in my discourse recounting this discourse. And that is because there was another section that we began the piece with that brought the 16 segments to 17 segments, because we did a reading as well of Michael Mersel's introduction to this piece. So this must be part 7. And here, having now determined that it can be represented by the number 7, I'll provide the subtitle to Notes Toward a Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration and or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling, Part 7, which is Parabassis, Chimeras, and discursive domains of rhetorical deception. And Parabassis is of course the plural of Parabassis, and Parabassis is a 5th generation muse, the 5th generation muse of transgression. But when we say transgression, I want to clarify that there's a whole realm of stepping overs and stepping outs that this particular muse relates to, and I talk about some of those stepping overs and stepping outs and what perhaps the initial reference is, but how this develops in this 5th generation of muses and how it's deployed in what David Antin does in this part of the work, which is to return to his discussion of Kathy Acker, both as a student and as a deployer of discursive domains of rhetorical deception, both inside the confines of her literary work and extra literarily as well in the construction of her life, and one could say narrative identification, right? And specifically, we'll focus on the representation of Herbert Marcuse as being one of her teachers at UCSD, which is obviously an example of rhetorical deception in narrative storytelling, but it's extra literary, right? Because this was a story that she told about herself. Just like, Eleanor Antin tells this story about being a student of Ossie Davis, right? Or that, David Antin tells these stories about being good friends with Andy Warhol. And all of these are, you could say, extra literary or extra fictive narrative identifications, which rely upon discursive domains of rhetorical deception as examples of producing, right, frameworks in which that control, in a certain sense, the way that an artist wishes to be read. And so and David promises to return to this in the final section of his performance. But what he wants to do here is to use this muse, this 5th generation muse, Parabassis, to discuss, to return to his discussion of Kathy Acker as a collage artist, and to complicate, right, and in a certain sense, challenge his initial reading of Acker, and to explain, his oversimplification of Acker as yet another example of the deployment of rhetorical deception in order to create, these kind of stepping stones, through which we can return to, these ideas of simple oppositions, like the simple opposition between collage and narrative, right? Which, no serious thinker would imagine that you could draw a line between, an idea of arrangement and an idea of some like abstract idea of the way that a story might be told as a linear unfolding. I mean, what would that look like? I guess it would look something like, David says, I guess it would look something like this. Like, if we imagine narrative were as simple as this, it's unified one-to-one correspondence between, occurrences in time, and the way that they were recounted as a story, it would look like something like this. Mary, asleep in her bed, woke. She flung her legs, to the side of the bed, and her feet touched the ground. She then shifted the weight in her body and rose to the full height, in which she represented a 5 foot 9 inch 23-year-old woman. She carefully walked to the closet and examined the options that she had for clothing. In today was, I can't say today was a special day, because I've now instigated, right? I've instigated a memory and a potential analepsis back to why today was a special day. So I've already violated, the strict linear unity of the coherence of my one-to-one correspondence between events as they're constructed as story, and these imaginary, then this imaginary opposition between collage and narrative, in which the literal coherence of time is represented as some agent of malfeasance, and you get the idea. But it simply can't be done, right? And so David's point is that he wants to return and rethink some of these some of the ways in which the history of muses has been overly simplified and deployed, right, as a strategy, more as a strategy to keep things in their designated boxes than really to explore the world. And he claims that his job, as he sees his job, and as he sees his inheritance as belonging to this genealogy or lineage of melete, that is to say thought, meditation, practice, occasion, is rather to question why something might be in this box as opposed to the other, and to actually look in the box, maybe pick it up, examine alternative uses for it, and suggest other ways in which the organization of our deep experiences might be more significantly engaged at deeper levels of attentiveness and understanding and ethical concern, to some extent, than they might be if we just left them in their boxes and assumed that Campbell's was selling us a perfectly reasonable tomato soup, right? And in other words, there are many ways to eat tomato soup, and a prepackaged can of Campbell's soup, whether that prepackaged can of Campbell's soup is selling you the difference between narrative and collage, or whether it's selling you the difference between chicken noodles and and tomato soup doesn't really much matter, right? So what we begin with, here, where in a certain sense, Cleo has taken us here, is to this muse, this word, Parabassis, and this idea of a stepping over, a stepping beyond a true transgression. If someone in the audience, were to say at this moment, why Parabassis, and the rhetorical gesture of violating, the silence. That's a sort of implicit logic or implicit, rule in the language game performed here would point, to the definition of this word, and perhaps in a certain way to its origin from Thalia, from Greek comedy, in which Parabassis was a moment in which the characters performing as representation on stage. Say it was Eleanor Antin performing her black ballerina in the Ballet Russe, suddenly dropped that character and addressed the audience in this kind of Brechtian alienation effect shattering manner. And either talked about the interesting thing is that sometimes it's difficult for the even the act of the Parabassis in Greek comedy wasn't really a stepping into the real world. I mean, the chorus spoke to the audience directly, but it was still a representation of a chorus, or sort of community voice, strophe and antistrophe, movement, right, and harken back to terpsichore in a certain sense, the dance and the movement of point and counterpoint as dance, and the relationship between discursive verbal domains and the movement of the dance. I take this step, I correct this step with this step. And even walking, right? Walking is in some way like a representation of a kind, right? A kind of relationship to dialectic. I don't just hop, right? I engage in strategies of balance and reciprocal movement, right, to advance forward. And he points out that sometimes we imagine that these domains of rhetorical deception that sometimes we identify as fiction in the telling of tellings, in a telling, whether it's a telling of tellings or what appears to be a simple telling, that you can just step out of and step into some real in the way that perhaps Bertolt Brecht imagined that you could do, and that you could have these actors tell stories about who they were, and this is not unfamiliar in like examples like living theater as well, right? Like these are the actors and we're here and this is our reality, but in a certain way, it's also another deception, because it's another mode of a narrative identification, in which a mythos is utilized, to construct an image of a particular subject. And just as at a certain point, Eleanor Antin started, including in her biography this story of performing this play, for Ossie Davis, then the reality of that story and the significance of that story in the biography, right? Takes on a significance that it may not have had, and the way, and this is certainly as David points out, the way that he returns to the figure of Andy Warhol is another one of these examples of now. Did I, says David, ever talk to Andy Warhol? Well, I mean, my story will tell you, that I did, and you can take that, you can take that as a fact if you like, but really it belongs to this domain of narrative identification and the story that I tell about myself. And why I tell that story, and how that story changes, over time, and how that story is related to the story that I tell about Kathy Acker, and why I tell the story about Warhol and Kathy Acker. I've had a lot of students, over the years, but I don't often name them, David, says, admits. And the reason for that is it's complex, but it bears upon all of these domains of communicability and social status and economics that promote a certain kind of myth, in Roland Barthes' sense, the ideology, right, of this myth, and the figure of that this portrait creates in the telling, in the narrative identification, and the cast of characters that come into the play, whether it's a comedy or a drama, construct me as, not unlike a certain type of hero, right? And all of this. So Parabassis, is it Parabassis or Parabassis? Let's listen to recorded pronunciation and see if we can find out.
Parabassis.
Well, she is saying Parabassis, so I'll just go with Parabassis. So
Parabassis.
yes, Parabassis. That's good. But let's say that yes, Parabassis. Let's say that these domains of rhetorical deception, right, are limited. Parabassis. Let's say that these domains of rhetorical deception are limited to those confines, right? Those examples of theatricalized, and I'm using theatrical in the broad sense here. It doesn't necessarily have to be representation of a comedy or a tragedy or some other completely fictive stage space. I'm including the stage space that David Antin is performing in here as that kind of stage space. And I'm including the idea of such a stage space in what I'm performing in returning to what David Antin is performing, and how David Antin knew that I would be reiterating his performance and had anticipated the interlocking fictive stage spaces in such a way that he could articulate this as if he were talking about someone, talking about his performance. I do not know. There's and this piece, there should perhaps be an additional disclaimer in this piece. David Antin, largely regarded as narrative and rhetorical genius, has a wealth of skills and abilities in both the narrating, storytelling, and the meta-rhetorical performance of referring to the storytelling as he does it, and is recognized for these abilities, and I'm rather poor at all and every aspect of this, and I'm clearly not. If I were good at it, and it would be obvious enough, that when I ask for letters of recommendation, that I I wouldn't have been told, oh, well, I didn't get to it yet, but here are a couple of sentences, and you can retype this up and put it in an envelope and fake my signature for it, right? So clearly, if I were any good at it, I would have gotten the requested letters of recommendation and gotten into better graduate program, and learned more about the way that geniuses talk about collage, and the way that geniuses talk about narrative and how it's done, and how to do it correctly, and how not to do it. Now, and again, like how David anticipated that I or someone like me would be narrating his discussion of an analysis of these extraneous, right? These extraneous domains of fictive possibility that from his point in time, this moment in which we're looking at this figure represented, just some potential, future horizon of meta discursive commentary, is way beyond me, and such strategies, I, as part of this disclaimer, should note, I'm not capable of, whereas he most definitely was, but there's an assumption in the Parabassis, that in this use in the comedy, right? That stability in whatever the formulation of the hard line between the fiction and that universe, that domain in which the audience finds itself attendant to the fiction, can be transgressed, and it's not so much the much is often made of these ontological reality, transgressions that define, postmodernism. But, like these interlocking, boxes of narratives. And suddenly the author, as in perhaps in a Raymond Queneau narrative, the flight of Icarus, the character wants to leave the novel and enter the real world, right? And that's, certainly a narrative strategy, a strategy of the fiction that grows out of this device in Thalia, this device of Parabassis. Was it Parabassis?
Parabassis.
And
Parabassis.
but as the Muse emerges, David makes a point of this. As the Muse Parabassis emerges in this fifth generation, it's this aspect of transgression. It's this aspect of transgression and the stepping out, and this stepping out also has a relationship to the stepping out that we can define as belonging to ecstasis, right? Yet another Greek idea, the stepping out of consciousness, transcendence, and into some domain, some perhaps transgressive domain of ecstasy and Dionysian experience. This idea of Dionysian or Dionysiac, revelry and ecstasis that belongs to the Elysian mysteries, re-enters the domain of aesthetic and experience and artistic expression in the figure of Parabassis, and it largely does so, at least in the later part of the 20th century. In this post-beat, in this post-beat period that David is discussing and returns to, here in his discussion of Kathy Acker and his return to the figure of Kathy Acker and the complication of what he initially said about her work as a collage artist, and he introduces the Muse Parabassis as we could say this is like the Muse of punk in a certain way, the Muse of transgression, of these defined spaces. Those spaces are not merely determined by this binary opposition between fiction and nonfiction, or fiction and reality, right? The fiction of Herbert Marcuse as Kathy Acker's teacher, and the reality of David Antin as Kathy Acker's teacher, right? But the whole ethos and the whole project, the whole inspiration of the Muse Parabassis. Was it Parabassis or Parabassis? I think it was Parabassis. Belongs to the idea of transgression on multiple levels, and that also includes the transgression of one could say staying in one's designated muse box, right? When you say you're an epic poet, and you evoke your muse as Homer evokes his muse. Muse, O Calliope, tell his tale of Odysseus and how he did this and how he did that and how this one did this and this one did that. But he doesn't transgress that box, and he doesn't say, and please get your sister Euterpe, to set all of this to some music, and let's hear some let's hear some jazz in the background while we do it all, and don't forget terpsichore. When we get to the part where Odysseus returns home and is greeted by his faithful dog Argos, let's have the dancers come in, and each of them will perform with her own little puppy, and they'll be dancing dogs, and he doesn't bring in, right, this one could say Metapoetics of muses. A Metapoetics of muses doesn't exist for Homer. He's an epic poet, and neither does it exist for Sophocles. Because Sophocles belongs fairly exclusively to Melpomene, and it doesn't exist for Sappho, who belongs fairly exclusively to Erato, and it doesn't exist for Herodotus, who belongs fairly exclusively to Clio, right? And it doesn't exist for Aristophanes. Maybe it does exist for Aristophanes because comedy is something unusual, but generally, Aristophanes, belongs fairly exclusively to Thalia. But because of the intensity, right, of this muse, Parabassis, and he points back, and it doesn't begin with Kathy Acker, and it certainly doesn't begin with William Burroughs. But you find Parabassis, you find this muse, in certain examples of the way that, for example, Baudelaire's flaneur, right, or his construction of decadence and the artificiality, this the painter of ordinary life, somehow he steps out of the fiction in which life is being depicted as this kind of theatrical stage, and starts wandering around the world. And Gerard de Nerval, walking his lobster on the streets of Paris is another example, of this transgressive Parabassis. And so is Alfred Jarry, in a certain sense, who transgressed so much. When Arthur Rimbaud makes this suggestion about a systematic derangement of the senses, and starts talking about not the life of the poem, but how, as a kind of theatricalization, the poet becomes a shaman and performs in this betwixt and between space, right? That violates, so much. Like and one of the basic, one of the basic boxes that Parabassis, seems to violate. David, points his attention to this, is that between the profane and the sacred, right? And as any great, scholar of the distinctions between the profane and the sacred realize that these transgressions always exist in the crossings of betwixt and between, right? And the sacred, relies upon the transgression of such boundaries, right? So when Rimbaud is, telling you to go get drunk and transcend ordinary consciousness and become a beggar and become a thief and become a madman, he's essentially making a claim about the sacred and calling for a kind of experience of this divine ecstasis and stepping out that belongs to the construction of transgression as parabasis. It was parabasis, right? Not parabasis. And then he all of a sudden, from apparently, out of nowhere, nowhere, he performs this verbal non sequitur. He says, you were on the road to Thebes. How would you know who you were? Say, he says, you were on the road to Thebes. How would you know the figure that you encounter in the road was your father? Say, he says, you were on the road to Thebes. How would you know, even if you did realize the figure that you encounter on the road was your father, how would you know what muse he resides under? Say, he says, you were on the road to Thebes. How would you know whether you were Oedipus or Laius or the Sphinx? And that's what we're looking for. Okay, the hand gesture that accompanies that. How would you know whether you're Oedipus or Laius or the Sphinx? And he says, and you wouldn't know because you're still in this state of not in the noresis, right? But in the agnoresis, the not knowing. So you can't know from the stories that you tell about yourself, from the stories of narrative identification that you're familiar with telling about yourself. You can't know from whether you tell this story, that you used to work for Ossie Davis, or what good friends you were with Andy Warhol, because within that story, in this particular encounter, you still reside within the agnoresis, the not knowing, and you have to get to the not knowing, the double negation of the knowing, which is in some ways is a return to the knowing itself, as if one were coming from there, but one was never really coming from there to begin with, because one was always trying to escape it, right? I mean, that's why Oedipus is on the road, is because he's trying to escape in a certain way. He already does know. He knows within the confines of the prophecy, right? He knows the ultimate the ultimate destiny, like that he's trying to avoid, is already something that he knows, and so in order to avoid it, he has to pretend that he doesn't know, or he has to enact the not knowing in such a way that he can circumvent like this knowing that he doesn't desire. And then within this, what is an apparent non sequitur, and which this non sequitur itself has opened up into a discursive domain, and cast itself as a kind of framework, a theater, a stage, upon which this action is unfolding. He says, so suppose that this particular Oedipus, this particular version of Oedipus, is Kathy Acker. And it's Kathy Acker is on the road to Thebes, and she encounters this man. And in the form of narrative identification, when she steps off the stage and tells this story, or maybe it's made as a meta-commentary within the telling by the chorus. And when she leaves the stage and the chorus steps in, the Parabassis steps in and says, that guy. Maybe it says, that woman on the stage is Oedipus. Maybe it says, that woman playing Oedipus is Kathy Acker. And that guy playing Laius is Herbert Marcuse. And maybe the chorus tells you why. And maybe it doesn't. And maybe the chorus tells you something about, why this figure of Herbert Marcuse is playing the part of Laius, or maybe it doesn't. But something is going on, and the stepping out, right? The Parabassis that wants to tell you something within another context and another frame, another fictional box, is engaging in a form of deception. And then he makes this, he reveals himself, right? Like this is the revelation. Like this is the great, moment of anagnoresis. He says, "I'm Herbert Marcuse. It's me. I'm Herbert Marcuse. I'm the father. I'm the like that moment in Star Wars, when Darth Vader, tells Luke Skywalker, "I'm your father, Luke." It's like right after Luke has lost his hand. I think it's been a long time since I've seen Star Wars, but this is the moment he said, "It's me. I'm Herbert Marcuse." There is no Herbert Marcuse. Like, Herbert Marcuse is an illusion. You can see he's explaining. Herbert Marcuse is an illusion. There was no Herbert Marcuse at UCSD at this time. And then he's going to go back and he's going to explain. So why? And this is the function of the chorus. Why then, did we have to pretend that the guy in Laius's mask was Herbert Marcuse when I was Herbert Marcuse all along? And this is where he introduces this idea of domains of deception. Domains of rhetorical deception are discursive. They're not lies. They're discursively relevant engagements with the way that an identification narrative produces itself in terms of a story as constituting an external frame for the interpretation of certain discursive acts. And the discursive acts that he claims that are performed through this misrepresentation or misrecognition of the figure of Herbert Marcuse as David Antin are largely related to Marcuse's idea of repressive desublimation. And so in order to understand why Herbert Marcuse is playing the part of David Antin, playing the part of Laius to Kathy Acker's role as Oedipus, when in fact, he claims that Kathy Acker is actually the Sphinx, right, in the performance, and merely pretending, like a wolf with sheep's clothes, in a certain sense. He says that, you know, it's really Oedipus encountering Herbert Marcuse on the road to Thebes is actually the Sphinx. You know, Kathy Acker as the Sphinx, playing the role of Oedipus, encountering Herbert Marcuse, who is really me, but I'm not there. And the omission, you know, he finds in a certain way, you know, both amusing and disturbing. But and you can see that, you know, the disturbance and the amusement represented in his hand movement here. So I'll focus on that a little bit. But the point is, he says, is to make reference to Marcuse's notion of repressive desublimation. So at this point, then, you know, we have to talk about what. And again, I'm not a professional speaker, and I'm certainly not a professional thinker, and not being very smart, I won't be able to convey these ideas as significantly or as deeply as David does in his piece. But, you know, bear with me. So Marcuse's idea of, and you have to understand, there's like really in relationship to either Clio, right? Historical truth, if there is such a thing. The encounter with Marcuse, right, isn't made under the aegis of the Muse aletheia, chance, aletheia, chance. It's not a chance encounter. The encounter with Herbert Marcuse is not, you know, made under the aegis of Clio. That is, it's not a historical truth or belong to the linear, you know, narrative, linear story, right? That is a series of events that we can constitute as Kathy Acker's life. It's made under the aegis of melite, thought, meditation, practice, occasion. It's discursive, right? It's not made under arche. It's not made as a sign of conflux or confluence. You know, that, you know, Kathy Acker and Herbert Marcuse happen to be on the same road at this particular moment, and this is the way that it would be discussed, you know, or or, you know, John Cage, you know, John Cage could make an opera out of it, or he could do you know 4 minutes and 33 seconds of that exact moment in which, you know, Herbert Marcuse and Kathy Acker were on the same road, and what it sounded like, and that maybe there was a sphinx in the background, and you could hear it growling in the background, and maybe you know, you could hear the chariot wheels as Herbert Marcuse, you know, drove up. And maybe you could hear, you know, Kathy Acker's feet, you know, plodding along as she was playing the part of Oedipus. You know, all of this, and this could be the representation. But in a way, it would already be too representational, and Cage wouldn't do it that way, right? So this is not it either, and all of it, you know, it all sounds very charming and could belong to Thelxinoe, and if Kathy Acker were doing it, it would have all of these elements in it, right? Because she's a chimera, because she is the Sphinx. She's not Oedipus, right? So there's going to be all this stuff going on. There are going to be references to Memne. There's going to be references to the Lexini. and she's going to move from muse to muse, and she's going to play out the arche. And the way that she plays out the arche, like say that, like let's take Great Expectations for an example. Say that she's on the road and she's playing Oedipus, but she's really the Sphinx, and she encounters Herbert Marcuse. But all of this happens within a Charles Dickens novel, and her name is either Philip or Pyrrha because she can't pronounce it correctly, or somebody can't. And we encounter this. We encounter this as the material. The material paragraph that represents the opening of what's a chapter called plagiarism, and that is the representation of the first chapter of this novel, or what she calls a novel, right? Because it belongs to this domain, that exists after pezographia, after prose became a muse. And yet what she does is she collages, but she collages in a certain way under the conditions of arche, origin, element, being, materiality, all that stuff Greg Dworkin and the concrete poets are interested in, right? We see the passage. We see the passage from Charles Dickens, and we're reminded that it's a material, that it was cut, like in the way that Burroughs cuts up this stuff and brings it in as a material form, because she's interested in the arche, just like when she's living on the streets, right? Or she's living in these seedy neighborhoods, either in New York or San Francisco, or it doesn't really matter where it is, right? It doesn't really matter. What matters is the grit and the grime and the seediness that belongs to this experience. In a certain way, it belongs to the experience of the muse, of Parabasis, right? The transgression. And the transgression and the arche get mixed together. Parabasis and arche, they're these strange, parents to this punk experience, right? Of the grit and grime of the material world that enters in to the making of the aesthetics of both what exists as the literary fictive domain of the poetic choices, but also in terms of the context of the life lived, right? As the external framing device to this, right? That we can't really say is entirely, non-fictional or just another level of fiction, but engages this performance, this fictive performance of who Kathy Acker is as the choices that she makes about, her living conditions. And this is why, when these elements, when she's discussing or when she's describing in the novel, this narrating subject is describing in the novel, walking at night, and the only other the people that she sees, are prostitutes on the street, or muggers or whoever it might be, and she feels comfortable in this domain. It's because because certain choices are made in terms of what these transgressions are, and then the exploration of this world, right, that contains the seeds of these potential transgressions, and it's all it's all very much like Baudelaire or like Rimbaud in a certain way, and the way that it gets played out, though, that what makes it different is that it's done also in relationship to. You have to understand that in Kathy Acker, there are these twin dominants, right? So and all of this that I'm saying now is all David saying all of this. This is the voice of David Antin. I'm just really repeating what David says here, and none of what I'm doing is adding anything at all. I'm just trying to recount what David does. So he goes back to Jakobsen. Remember that he's still moving toward like an understanding of what repressive desublimation means in Marcuse and why Marcuse enters Kathy Acker's discourse, right? Okay, so he goes back to Jakobson. So Jakobson, he says, he argues that, in every work of art, there's a conceptual dominant, and you could think of the muse as like a conceptual dominant, right? And this guy's muse, my muse is Melite, and my muse is the muse of thought, meditation, practice, and occasion. And Cage, the dominant muse for John Cage is arche, right? Origin, element, being, right? The now. And Calliope, that's Homer's muse, right? And he goes through this long list, and in that first version that we told of the story of Oedipus, that we told from Aristophanes, we're under the domain of Thalia. All right, so then he says, but you have to understand, he says, that for Kathy Acker, she was really torn between these two dominating muses, but even in being torn by the two dominating muses, the way that she was torn was a vehicle through which all of these other muses, could enter as a kind of inspirational force, both motivating the construction of the work, but also motivating the construction of the life surrounding the work. And there, when he's waving his arms like this, that's the life surrounding the work, right? That seems to exceed the value of the work. So she's not just a collage artist, like I said before, right? And the work isn't just about piecing these pieces together. There's like talking about piecing the pieces. Let's go back to that, because that was very nicely done. Piecing the work together, like the way that you would imagine, like with scissors or whatever, you make your collage, because he had said that she was very careful that, there he goes, to make the pieces together. Putting them together. There's putting the collage pieces together. But it's not really all about that. It's about all of these frames of discursive engagement, including Marcuse, meeting Marcuse on the road to Thebes, right? And encountering in this figure of Marcuse this obstacle. And what is the obstacle? The obstacle is Marcuse's discourse regarding repressive sublimation and what that means, and how this obstacle, for this was an obstacle in the course of and inspiration of one of Kathy Acker's profoundest muses, and we already have to understand that she was divided, in her allegiance to these muses, and didn't, as Roman Jakobson, would have formulated, like fall under the domain of this dominant muse, right? Like Cage, whose dominant muse is arche, and certainly, depending upon the singularity of one's work, it's not like there never was an artist before Kathy Acker, that didn't take inspiration from a number of different muses. We all do that, but the degree to which one becomes chimerized, or chimerized by conflicts, and controversies and oppositions, between in the conversation between these muses, varies from poet to poet, and can certainly, and this is perhaps why some artists are torn apart. He hints that in these artists of Parabassis and Transgression, that something is going on, and we could make a lineage of them, perhaps, but they're familiar to all. Our toe belongs to them, right? And Susan Sontag's interest in Artaud, belongs to them. And Patti Smith, belongs among those who participate with this muse parabasis, and certainly Rimbaud does, and certainly and what emerges, right? What emerges in the 60s and the 70s, this punk ethos and punk aesthetics that Kathy Acker most certainly belongs to parabasis, and what can't be overlooked in this in the inspiration of this particular muse is the shamanic and ecstasis, the shamanic and ecstatic element of the transgression. Because the stepping out is the stepping out from the banal, the stepping out from the ordinary, the stepping out from the commercial. So in the 50s, when we were overwhelmed by these commercials that interrupted our basic narrative, this was the opposite of a kind of parabasis or stepping out. Or there's another term, right? That bears upon all of this. So there's another name for this this particular experience of aspects of this muse parabasis, and the transgression of stepping out or violating a kind of domain, and the restrictions of that domain, and this word is visionary. So to understand Kathy Acker, you have to understand, first of all, how profoundly that she's inspired by the muse of transgression, and in all of its various aspects, as challenging, right? As challenging these constructions of fictive space versus narrative identity, and the way that the challenge of that fourth wall convention is such an inherent and inextricable part of the way that she works, so that walking the streets at night, both enters into the fictive domain, but the fictive domain, inspires the walking of the streets, and even in choosing of the neighborhoods to begin with, right? And also, how this is all, in a certain way, an exploration of ecstatic and visionary consciousness, a changing of the conditions under which the phenomenology of mind and experience operates within the creative subject, because after all, she's an artist, right? So she's going to use this material to generate art and materials, but also she's going to become the art and the material. Her body is going to be utilized in the same way, because it belongs to the way that parabasis explores, right, the hidden dimensions of this system of transgressions as stepping into and stepping out of, and then you have to equally understand that in addition, to being inspired by the muse of parabasis, that unlike these guys, like that Roman Jakobson maybe would have understood as being dominated by a single muse, that she's this chimera that's also equally beholden, to Kolázia, right? This fifth generation muse, Kolázia, that says, make it this way, combine this with that, combine that with this, combine, these makeshift figures that can be put together in the form of this or that chimera, and then maybe tomorrow or the next day torn apart again and recombined as something else. And so when she's putting together these pieces of whatever they might be, Charles Dickens with something else, with maybe collaged with a high school yearbook, right? She's taking a part of arche and she's using that as maybe her hands, in this particular moment, because she's collaging. She gets interested in the arche. She gets interested in the materials themselves, what it looks like on the page, and that becomes part of her work, in forming these vastly complex, right, and chimerical reconstructions of that always in some way belong to Parabassis, and always in some way belong to Kolázia, but never really, right, are contained even within that dispute, because there's always some additional element coming in, because collage, and because in the confluence or the collision of collage and transgression, like there becomes a moment in which the meta dimensions, right, of reorganization and of the space of this transgression in all of its various aspects, right, are basically uncontained, and who is the figure, who is the patriarch on the road, blocking her way? Well, it's this figure of Herbert Marcuse, and Herbert Marcuse's construct of repressive desublimation, and what that represents is this idea that he developed that in late capitalism, that one of the means of suppression or repression took on this mask. One could say that there's a mask that repression takes on, and the suppressive apparatus, right, of the control of desire. Now, in transgression, you're talking about unlimited desire, and this transcendent realm that's attained, like outside of the culture, right, through kind of like actively engaged and inspired and relentless critique and exploration of all of the facets of desire, particularly transgressive aspects of desire. And this is what Kathy was all about. So who's the obstacle? The obstacle is this idea that comes from Herbert Marcuse, that in late capitalism, that there really are no restrictions, that everything is authorized, that the pornography is right there for you, and it becomes reabsorbed into the machinery of capitalism, and becomes like one of these commercials, where the snow is falling and they're trying to sell you soap, and there is no productive space or creative space of transgression, because everything has been reabsorbed. And this is the way that the repression works. Not by telling you no anymore, but by telling you yes. And this is what the definition of repressive sublimation is. And you can see how it's a problem. You can see how this idea is a problem if your muse is Parabassis, right? Can you see how that's a problem? And if you're the Sphinx and your muse is Parabassis, you're going to have to deal with Herbert Marcuse. And there are a lot of ways of dealing with Herbert Marcuse, he says, And she could have, she could have written an essay about it, and she could have, said, well, I'm going to live my life this way, and it's going to address, this figure in the road, this Laius figure who's come to kill me, come to kill me because he knows what my destiny is on this road to Thebes. And so, you know, I've been working out, and she does, right? She works out, she lifts weights and all this stuff, and she's like, I know how to kill this guy. But that's not the way that she does it. She does it by reinventing, you know, the fictional frame that contextualizes her history, you know, as an emergent artist, right? Which doesn't belong to the internal frame of the story of Oedipus on the Road, nor does it belong to the internal frame of the fiction represented by Great Expectations, or The Rise of the Black Tarantulas, or The Secret Nights of 101 Kathy Ackers, or some other, you know, meta collage chimera, right? But this is how the encounter is made, and what it betrays, and the deception, the rhetorical deception beneath it, is that it's also an encounter with me, he says, because I'm Laius on the road, and the problem that I pose is this problem of collage and narrative, which you know, thus far hasn't engaged the idea of arche, or has engaged the idea of arche, but only within the limited dimensions of materials that are allowed for collage, right? So, and then this is when he points back to the body. So there's a difference between, you know, he says, there's a difference between, you know, collaging like materials and collaging unlike materials. There's a difference between collaging, you know, classical materials and materials that you might, you know, find in the garbage. And this is the force of the critique, because within the residing, you know, muse, or this muse that is in such, you know, fierce, you know, conflict, you know, and it wouldn't necessarily seem this way. Why would there necessarily be a conflict, you know, between parabasis and collage? Well, in a certain way, there isn't. You know, the punk ethos was always a collage ethos, right? And you could say that one of the ways of stepping out of the self, you know, is by finding materials that you didn't make. But where it becomes a conflict is precisely through, you know, this obstacle in the road that's presented by Herbert Marcuse. Because where it becomes a conflict is where this collage material can go in terms of its commercial development and its reabsorption, you know, into the apparatus of capital. And if the collage material can be reabsorbed into the apparatus of capital, you know, in the same way that desire can, right? Then the problem and the problematics becomes, you know, the types of moves that you make with collage, you know, whether they represent ways of rescuing desire, or the types of moves that you make with desire, do they become a means of rescuing collage? And you have to do both simultaneously. So this was Kathy's problem, that you have to do both simultaneously, and you have to do so, right, by reconstituting this problem in both dimensions, in both a narrative dimension, so a story, and the story becomes, you know, when I was at UCSD, you know, my main teacher was Herbert Marcuse, and then there's a gap, you know, there's a certain kind of gap or aporia or contradiction in what's missing from the narrative events and what the meaning, right, of the rhetorical section points to, which is entirely about this idea of repressive desublimation, and how, you know, it's going to be one of the key problems that's worked out over the course of Kathy's work. And then the second figure of collage, you know, will do the same. How is this figure of collage, you know, going to be redeemed or reclaimed? You know, we should say reclaimed from the commercial realm, you know, which seems to have abducted it, you know, and redeployed it against, right? Against, like, and according to the terms of Marcuse, against the radically transgressive and visionary possibilities that belong to Parabassis. And this is essentially the problem. And it becomes, for Kathy Acker, it becomes a feminist problem that is an engagement of patriarchy. And so this role, right? This role as, we could say, maybe define, he says, we maybe could define this role that she plays in terms of Oedipus as whatever is the opposite of a dutiful daughter. And the idea of there being a memoir, right, of the opposite of a dutiful daughter is enters in the space of the collage. One could say, both as a framing device, in the construction of figures like Marcuse as obstacles in the road to Thebes, but also as internal constructions within, the various fictions as ways of performing alternative and potential detours, in the encounter that necessarily represents this moment of peripeteia and anagnoresis. And because of that, he says, this is why in Kathy Acker's discourse, she never mentions my name. And it's up to me, to underscore and outline, all of the complexities of the rhetorical deceptions involved in that omission. And there's more, but we'll perhaps leave the rest of this section for later.